aged just 2 have received death threats. Alicia Kearns chairs the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. She's installed panic alarms at home and says threats have come from home and abroad.
The reality is now that MPs across all colours face frequent death threats. There is an underlying daily basis of hostility, but the reality is that my children, who are only 2 and 4, they've had death threats.
The NHS says 196,000 hospital appointments and procedures had to be rearranged last week because of the junior doctors' strike in England, but it's warning the true figures likely to be much higher. And Downing Street says Rishi Sunak was transparent about an interest which is being investigated by Parliament's standards watchdog. It's understood the accusation relates to his wife's shares in a childcare agency. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 7 points at 78.79. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.13. LBC weather, most areas dry with clear spells tonight and a low of 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Monday's Cross Question. Your chance to ask my panel of 4 politicos any question you like. It could be about Rishi Sunak calling for more focus on maths being taught in schools. It could be on Labour saying that their attack ads against the Tories have only just begun and lots more will follow. There are calls for reform of the Grand National after protests disrupted the main event and 3 horses died during the weekend of racing. And more people, as you heard in the last hour, are turning to private GPs. But feel free to ask whatever you like. The number to call 0345 6060 973. Let me introduce you to my panel. On my left we have Samuel Kasumu, former advisor on race and communities to Boris Johnson. He now wants to be the Conservative Mayor of London. Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, independent MP for Islington South.
North.
Pardon?
North.
Islington North. Oh, see, someone's head is going to roll, or maybe a deputy head will roll. Sarah Olney is Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park. She's the party's Treasury and Business Spokesperson. And Nick Gibb is Conservative Schools Minister and MP for Bognor, Regis and Littlehampton. They're here to answer your questions. As I say, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Emily Thornberry, if she's listening, got a bit of a surprise there. Right, let's go to our first caller. It's Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin. Martin, are you there? No, he's not there. Right, I've got his question on the screen here. He wants to ask, should the Chancellor be the one learning some more maths after saying the economy is back? Now, Jeremy Hunt said that other finance ministers are telling him Britain is back during his trip to Washington for an IMF meeting last week. Well, this neatly combines 2 stories, I guess, Nick Gibb. Now, as the schools minister, and we talked about this on the All Talk podcast that we did a few weeks ago, that there is this, that the Prime Minister seems very keen that everyone should learn maths to the age of 18. Jeremy Hunt clearly didn't.
Well, it is important that young people do continue to study maths after the age of 16. We're an outlier as a country in terms of the proportion doing that. A-level maths is the most popular A-level choice, but...
Is it?
Yes, it is. Not German, as you might have thought, Ian. Although German is also an important A-level as our modern languages, as you know. But, in the modern economy, we need those maths skills. And whatever level you leave GCSE at, and whatever you do next, whatever you're interested in, whether it's making films. We were at the London Screen Academy this morning, where the Prime Minister made this announcement, because actually, even in the creative industries, you need to have maths if you are designing sets for films or camera angles and so on. And in many walks of life that you think aren't necessarily requiring maths, they do actually need maths. You want to run your own business, you need to have some maths. So we want to make sure that more young people are taking maths, and we want to have the right qualifications for those people and their interests. And that's why we're appointing a panel of experts to advise us what does industry need in terms of those maths skills. We're also going to continue to work on the standards in primary and secondary school. They've been rising over the last 10 years. We've now gone up 10 places in the international survey of maths ability of our young people, but we need to go further. And we're having a new national...
But we're going up 10 places. That sounds good, but it could be going up from 80th to 70th.
No, we are near the top anyway, right, so okay. We're doing very well.
Just wanted to check.
Absolutely, it's worth checking.
Statistics and all that.
Absolutely, and if more people had statistics, then they'd be able to challenge politicians more effectively than they might otherwise do. We want to make sure that the apprenticeships have the right qualification maths content as well, and we're consulting with them. And we want to make sure that teachers in primary schools that want to spread what we call the Southeast Asian approach to teaching maths, because they are the countries that top all the league tables, that we're spreading that practice right across our primary and secondary schools, which has been a successful reform. We want more of that.
Now, what about the second part of the question? Jeremy Hunt was at the IMF. They've predicted that Britain is going to be the lowest growing economy of the G20. Must have been a little awkward for him there. But he says Britain is back. He says other finance ministers are telling him the same thing. And yet the economic statistics don't say that.
Well, since 2010, we're about the third highest growth rate in the G7 since 2010. Only 3 countries have been above us. And
it's what's happening now that matters to people.
And our inflation projections are to something like 2.9% inflation by the end of this year. You know, the Prime Minister is committed to making sure we restore growth to our economy. But the way you get growth is you have inflation under control, you have the public finances under control. We've got to get debt down as a proportion of our GDP. That's how you stimulate an economy. And that's what Jeremy meant by we're back, because we are getting inflation under control, which is why, of course, we have to make sure that the pay settlements across the public sector are affordable and don't generate and add to that inflationary pressure in our economy.
Just one quick question. So Sandra's just texted in. Where are these extra maths teachers coming from? Because we haven't got enough as it is.
Well, we struggle in our economy as a whole to recruit enough graduates. It's a very, it's a strong economy where graduates are in great demand in commerce, in business, and maths and physics graduates in particular. So we have introduced £27,000 tax-free bursaries to encourage maths graduates and physics and chemistry, computer science to come into teaching. We have what's called a level up premium to encourage teachers in their first 5 years to teach in areas of deprivation if they've got maths. So there's a whole range of policies to encourage teachers to come into the profession.
Jeremy Corbyn, how would your life have been different had you studied maths to 18?
I wished I had. My mother was actually a maths teacher.
Oh, really?
But unfortunately she was wonderful in many things, but except teaching me maths. I was not terribly good at maths at school, and it wasn't made interesting enough, it wasn't made exciting enough, and it wasn't made relevant enough to life. And what I always tried to do with my own children was, when they were very small, try and get them interested in maths by giving them endless Arsenal football-related weird questions in order to get them the idea of percentages, averages, fractions, and so on. And so I do think you have to make
maths... Did it work?
Yes, I think so. You had to make maths interesting, and indeed Arsenal, again, had a sort of double club thing for... students, primary school students who were underachieving in maths would go off and learn with Arsenal on it. So you've got to make maths interesting. But I just think, taking next point, now I welcome what the Prime Minister said. We need more focus on maths. I support that. I welcome that. But the fact is, of the new teachers we recruit, 25% are gone within 3 years, 33% are gone within 5 years, and the government cut the target for recruiting maths teachers since 2020 by 40%. So I'm grateful that we're now recruiting more maths teachers, but we have a problem in teaching that stress, pressure and pay mean that teachers are leaving the profession, and maths teachers can go and earn probably a great deal more with much less pressure elsewhere. But if we don't bring up our children understanding computing, science, maths and art, music and so on, and Nick's right that you can't develop music without maths, you can't do maths without music. The two things go together. So I think we need a much more holistic approach to education as well.
It would be cruel of me to say that 2 + 2 equals a draw at West Ham, wouldn't it?
it would be very unkind, but it would also be factually correct. Is that a helpful answer?
That's a very good answer. Politician's answer. Oh, Sarah.
Well, I mean, like Jeremy, actually, my one of my parents is a maths teacher, my father, and actually, thanks to his very patient guidance, I got an A in my GCSE.
Oh, no, to show off. No one likes to show off.
No, my point was, without that, really, really kind of dedicated support from my dad, I would not have achieved that. And I gave it up after GCSE. I went on to get a degree in English literature and language, which I don't regret and I really, really loved. But it became very clear to me quite soon after that it wasn't a great setup for a lucrative career. And so later in life, I went to study to become an accountant.
Joined the Liberal Democrats.
That happened even later. But I became an accountant. And actually, for me, it was a real revelation later on in life. It almost sort of starting again and really going through some of these basics of accounting and finance. And it was.
So you could do that without having a maths A-level or a degree?
It's a really accessible
Were you the
profession.
SNP's auditors?
The SNPs, they could certainly do with some extra maths lessons, my God. But no, my point is actually, it was much simpler to understand all these concepts. And I think people think there's a real fear of maths. And I think that's what the Prime Minister was talking about today. And I think it's absolutely right that we've got to try and overcome that. But, it's almost like speaking a different language. And I think in the same way that we teach children their ABCs and then we build up to reading stories, we need to build up some of those building blocks. The arithmetic is just the start. But it's about how do we use this? How can we use this tool? And I think one of the things I was disappointed with the Prime Minister today is he was talking just about, let's study more maths. But he didn't talk about what it is that he wants young people to be doing. Now, my daughter's in year 8 and I'm doing my best to help her with her maths homework. But the kind of algebraic equations that she's doing are so much more complicated than even I was doing for my GCSE. And I'm like, is this the right thing? Is this the sort of extra maths that the Prime Minister wants? Or is it, as Jeremy was saying, is it the fractions, the percentages, the averages? And some of the basic accounting that I learned in my 30s, I would have been so much better off learning them in my teens. I'd have been so much better equipped in the workforce when I went out, and I could have understood, the values of organisations, their monetary value, much, much better from a much earlier stage. And that's why I wanted to hear from the Prime Minister. What is it that he wants young people to learn and how do we engage them in it?
And why?
And why?
So, Samuel, is it making that, if you're going to study maths from 16 to 18, is it making it much more relevant to a work environment, for example?
Yeah, in a previous life, I ran a campaign for Lord Young's Startup Loans Initiative, and we supported about 6,000 entrepreneurs. All of them could have done with a very strong level of maths because they have to present spreadsheets, understand P&Ls, etc., much of the work that you were doing. So it's definitely without a shadow of a doubt
vocational
a
maths.
very important skill. But also for creatives, as you mentioned, a lot of the most creative people in the world have had maths or STEM-related subjects as an underpinning or foundation for their work. So it is important. What I would say is that on the point around teachers, I do agree we need more teachers, but teachers in and of itself is not the only solution. During the pandemic, we had a catch-up tutoring scheme that the government was delivering. And I remember we had people teaching using technology to reach millions of young people across the country. So I think you can be creative. And also a lot of teachers who are not maths teachers per se will also have a basic level of maths. So you can be completely creative and still achieve the objective of having people between the ages of 16 and 18 continuing to learn maths. I think
Jeremy, you want to come?
It's bringing young people to understand that maths can help in all sorts of ways. If you're an environmental campaigner, maths is part of it. Rate of deprivation, rate of growth of species, whatever, that sort of thing, music and so on. It is about understanding mathematical concepts and actually the beauty of maths. It's only much later in life I've begun to understand just how fascinating and beautiful the idea is of a construction of a mathematical objective and equation. And it can be used for good, it can be used for bad, it can be used for algorithms, it can be used for negative algorithms, but it is a skill and a knowledge that everybody should be able to have. And you don't really get that unless you have enough maths teachers.
Can I just say on that, though, I thought one of the other things I was disappointed with the Prime Minister earlier was when he said that adults should be embarrassed if they can't do maths. And I really feel like, it's kind of, if you can't do maths for whatever reason, let's give people the opportunity to go back. If they missed out on learning good maths when they were teenagers, let's give them the opportunity in their 30s or their 40s. We're not going to achieve that by shaming people. And I do think it's important. And I think this is what the Prime Minister is getting at. We need a cultural shift in the way we think about maths, but not by making people feel bad about their lack of knowledge.
Nick, what do you think about this idea? The three other panellists seem to all agree that so-called vocational maths would be a good thing to introduce at the age of 16. Is that what you're looking at doing?
Yes, precisely. It's about looking at, as I said, A-level maths is the single most popular A-level choice that sixth formers take. But we need to make sure that maths in other routes after the age of 16 is the right maths for those particular interests, whether it's an apprenticeship, whether it's working at the London Screen Academy, whatever you want to do, you need maths. And we need to make sure that we get the right kind of maths being taught. And that's why we've appointed this panel to advise us about the particular maths that we need. And taking up your point, Sarah, about the kind of basic arithmetic that you need to be an accountant as well. So we're very two interesting people.
I studied accounting, by the way.
I'm absolutely not an accountant.
Jeremy?
I've no plans to become an accountant either.
Well, we changed the primary curriculum when we came into office in 2010 to make it so that we were making sure children did acquire the basics of multiplying, adding, subtracting, and so on. So they have those mathematical skills early on in their school career. We brought in a multiplication tables test last year for the first time. Every 9-year-old took this computer-based test. The 27% got full marks, 25 out of 25, and the average score was 20 correct answers out of 25. So children now do know their tables. They are acquiring those basic arithmetic skills.
8 times 8.
64, but that's the last mathematical question. Did you know that?
Can I just quickly add?
66.
Can I quickly just add to that? Financial literacy is also equally as important and interconnected with maths. And I think a lot of young people need to have access to that kind of training too.
But somebody sent an Alexa message here. It's Nicola who says, if I'd been made to do compulsory maths until I was 18, when I was at school, I would have left as soon as possible. It's ridiculous. And if you're doing 3 A-levels or even 4 A-levels, what is the point? And they're artsy subjects. You're never going to do anything mathematical unless you're like Sarah and discover it later in life. But generally, for people who are doing sort of, English, history, geography, maybe, what's the point?
The point is that whatever you do with your English, history, geography, the chances are you will need some mathematics. And I was in that boat. I got an A as well, but in an O level, shows my difference of our ages.
They're all showing their grades around here, aren't they?
I'll come to you later. I wish I'd taken maths in the sixth form or some form. And really, this is what we're trying to do, make sure we get the right maths for those young people.
I'm not going to shame anyone about their grades, but I genuinely don't know. Right, we are going to move on in just a moment. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
joined us. We have the former leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, with us, Nick Gibb, Schools Minister, Sarah Olney, the Liberal Democrat, Treasury and Business Spokesperson, and Samuel Kasumu, who is running to be the Conservative candidate for Mayor of London. Is it next year there's a mayoral election?
Yes, May 2024.
May, right.
Yeah.
So we could have a mayoral election, a general election, and a US presidential election.
Well, Jeremy might be two of the three, right? I hear you might be running to be Mayor of London too.
You might hear lots of things.
Okay.
Feel free to make an exclusive announcement.
I'll tell you later.
Okay. Right, let's move on to our next question. It's from Anthony in Staines. Anthony, hello, what would you like to ask?
Oh, Ian, hello, everyone. It's if the Stum project fails and Labour fails to win the next general election, what next for Labour?
You think that's a serious possibility?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, you can't assume they're going to win. Look at 92. Don't ever assume anything in politics.
I'm not sure Labour was so far ahead in 92, he says, looking at Jeremy Corbyn. I don't remember.
They were ahead, I can't remember the
ahead,
figures.
but not 20 points ahead, although the lead is narrowing a little bit. Sarah Olney, let's come to you first on this. If the Starmer project fails and he doesn't win the general election, what's next for Labour? Or don't you care?
I wouldn't say I don't care, because clearly they're the principal opposition, and if we're going to have a new government, then we would expect them at least to be leading it, if not to be the majority party. I'm not going to make any secret of the fact that after the next general election, I very much want there to be a non-Tory government in number 10, because I think that the Tories have done so much damage over the last 8 years. I think a lot of things are going wrong in our economy and society at the moment, and I genuinely believe that without the fresh start that a new government can give us, we simply won't have the momentum that we need to make some of the changes that's required. But it's not for me to say what the Labour Party should be up to.
No, but if the lead continues to narrow and there's that Labour doesn't get an overall majority, you know the question that's coming now, don't you? I mean, is this a matter? I know you're not going to say, well, I can't announce what we would do on your programme. I get that. But is this a matter of serious discussion now within the Liberal Democrats? You had your spring conference a few weeks ago. Is that what people were talking about?
We weren't talking about the Labour Party at all. We were talking about the upcoming local elections, where we're very confident we're going to make some progress and win some council seats, possibly take control of some councils. We're really focused on that. That's really, really important to us. We're talking about our own policies, the things that matter to us, that we want to see in our manifesto. And then over the longer term, we're talking about the seats that we hope to win in the general election. We're putting our teams together. We're feeling really optimistic. In those seats where we think we can win, we will be working incredibly hard from now right up to the general election and beyond to persuade people, perhaps who voted Tory in the past, to look at the Liberal Democrats. And that's what we're focused on.
Nick?
Do you know that no Labour government has left office with unemployment lower than when it came into office? So if you want a stable, strong economy, you need to have consistency in a Conservative government. What the Labour Party would have to do when they lose the election
as opposed to
year,
if.
Yes, is to look at how they manage economies, because the history of the Labour Party is they get into power, they survive on the coattails of the previous Conservative government for 1 or 2 years, so things look quite good, and then their spending gets out of control, the economy tanks, they lose the election, and
the economy
unemployment
has already
rises.
tanked.
I'm thinking about what's happened over the last few years. Yeah, hang on. 13 years, and there are going to be very few people who can look you in the face on the doorstep in Bognor and say, I'm better off than I was in 2010.
We have been through some major crises. There's no question about that. COVID was a once-in-a-century crisis affecting this country and the world. We borrowed $450
billion. COVID is the new winter of discontent, is it?
Well, we borrowed £450 billion, and we were able to borrow it because of the stewardship of the economy leading up to that point after the banking crisis. And the capital markets were confident enough to lend us £450 billion, and they know they're going to get it back. But because of that,
they weren't after Truss's budget in September.
Well, I'm not saying that was a great triumph, but what I am saying is that Rishi Sunak is there, Jeremy Hunt is there. They're stabilising the economy. We did have the fastest growth in the G7 in 2021
you don't now.
and 2022.
We've got the lowest now.
No, but we will recover. All the hallmarks, all the fundamentals are there in place. We've got low unemployment. We've got inflation coming down. We've got a competent government.
Inflation went up last month.
Yes, but it's forecast by the OBR to be 2.9% in the fourth quarter of this year.
Do you seriously believe that's going to happen?
I do, provided, of course, we don't give in to pay settlements where people are demanding 35% pay increases. Of course, that would blow inflation apart. But the point about we were discussing the Labour Party, I just think if the Labour Party lose the election, they've got to look at how they manage economies, because their history, throughout the history of the Labour Party, is the damage they do to the British economy.
Under the Blair government, the economy was well managed. I mean, then the financial crash came. I mean, we can argue about sort of things that we might have done differently, but it generally was well managed. The financial crash came along. Gordon Brown was seen by everybody outside this country as almost the saviour of the world economy. It doesn't really fit into your narrative.
Because, there was the banking crash, of course, but also the way they had spent during that period meant that when we came into office in 2010, we had a budget deficit, an annual budget deficit of £156 billion
What is
year.
it now?
It's
a lot more.
We have been through the COVID crisis and we're trying to deal with that. But that was 11% of GDP that we were spending each year. We had to bring that down. And because of that, we were able to borrow during the COVID crisis.
Okay. Right, let's repeat the question. If the Starmer project fails and he doesn't win the general election, what next for Labour, Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, before I say that, just, Nick, I wonder which planet you're on at the moment, mate. I really do. Inflation, well over 12%. Food inflation, much more. More food banks in this country than branches
Jeremy, you're taking your pen
Sorry,
right into the microphone.
it's a very good pen, given to me by a trade union. You're suggesting that somehow the economy is doing well. Well, if you ask anyone who is worse off than they were 10 years ago, ask anyone like a teacher or a rail worker, a mail worker, what's happened to their wages, they won't be very, very happy. And you cannot say that wages have caused this inflation, because wages have actually fallen over the last 10 years. And if you actually got round the table with all the unions involved in the current disputes and paid them properly, you would actually have more money being spent in the economy, which would help investment anyway, and you would have a lot less poverty around and a lot less people claiming universal credit or top-ups in order to get through. Now, for the Labour Party, I think the important thing is to offer a real alternative. And I saw an analysis in the iPaper last week which said one of the problems was many of the public don't fully understand what Labour's economic strategy is, because they're so busy presenting themselves as being very good at managing the economy. Surely we've got to look at the structural problems. The structural problems are historic lack of investment. Structural problems are historic lack of training, historic problems of underpayment of teachers and medical workers, many of whom, if they can, emigrate or they go and do something else, even though they've been trained at public expense.
You put forward that case in 2019.
I put forward that case in 2019.
Yep.
Of course we lost the election. I fully understand that, but there are many reasons, one of which was issues around Brexit, I'm sure you'd understand. But individually, interestingly, the policies, particularly ones on public ownership of mail, rail, water and energy, were actually all publicly supported and still are. I think what we need is a much clearer alternative in the election.
But is it also down to the fact that, I mean, there was a YouGov survey at the weekend which showed that undecided voters, who, as you well know, they decide elections generally, they much prefer Rishi Sunak to Keir Starmer. Now, what do you put that down to?
I think he puts himself across as being, was new, of course, which is what he is, but also he probably trying to present himself as being financially and politically competent. I don't think he is, but it's an image that has been very carefully constructed over the last couple of months. But we are very early into his premiership.
Can I help?
I wouldn't know you can help me in a moment.
No, hang on a second. Hang on, because you just said you didn't think Keir Starmer was financially or politically competent.
No, I didn't say that. I said the presentation of Sunak was that he was financially competent.
Right.
That's what I said.
I heard you to say that you didn't think Keir Starmer was financially or politically competent.
That is not.
Well, I'm glad to have given you the opportunity to clear that up, because was I alone in hearing that?
He's already been cancelled by Keir.
I thought that was going to be a great newsline, Jeremy. You've let me down.
I'm sorry to let you down. But my fundamental point is there has to be a real alternative offered, and if there isn't a real alternative offered, people go to the status quo.
What they know. A lot of your supporters supporters and friends are really angry with Keir Starmer for effectively ditching all the promises that he made when he succeeded you, because his manifesto at that time, and there were 10 pledges, and they were all ones which I think you could have probably bought into.
They were all taken from the 17 and 19
and they've all
manifestos. All those 10 pledges were. And I was quite relieved, actually. Well, that's all right. My work has not been in vain, having got those two manifestos
But now you think
agreed
it has
by the
been?
party. Well, if we run away from what I believe were fundamental and reasonable policies to be offered to the British people. I mean, I was interviewed during the 2019 election by a Swedish journalist. He comes into my office, jumps in and says, "Right, Mr. Corbyn, tell me all about your extreme manifesto." So I sort of gave him a 2 or 3 minute description of what was in the policies. And he said, "Was that it?" I said, "Well, it's pretty good for this country." He said, "We did all that years ago. We've got stable economy, high living standards, good quality social services, good quality education, and a publicly run health service. Why don't you do the same?"
When he was elected leader, Keir Starmer on LBC described you as a friend. A few weeks ago on LBC, he says that you were never a friend. When you hear him say things like that, does that...
Makes me sad, actually. I don't know why he says that. I mean, I worked with Starmer. He was in the shadow cabinet. I went to Brussels with him. Yeah, I worked with lots of people.
Did you regard him as a friend?
I regarded him as a colleague. I never regarded him as a friend. I didn't spend time hanging out with him, all that sort of thing. A friend is somebody you go out for a meal with, have a chat, call their house, that thing now. So why he suddenly announced to the world I was a friend, and then a short time later announced I was not a friend? Well, this is primary school stuff.
Samuel.
Well, this is part of the problem with Keir Starmer, isn't it? And when you compare him to Rishi Sunak, I think most of the public feel like Rishi has a really clear plan about what he wants to do over the next 12 months.
They hear these 5 pledges and their motherhood and apple pie.
Well, certainly in terms of...
Jeremy would probably agree with them.
Certainly in terms of stabilising the economy, I think he has a really clear plan. And I think as the months go ahead and people can see that he is as competent as many people already believe he is, he'll be able to put to the public his plan for the country. But the issue with Keir here is, and probably the reason why they're not doing as well as perhaps they could be doing, is he's very...
20 points ahead.
Well, in some polls, but the polls are narrowing, is because he's very inconsistent. I mean, he tells you Jeremy was his friend, now he's not. He says he's different from all the politicians, and then you see these weird attack ads. He's just someone that is not very consistent, and therefore I don't think the public will be convinced about him the next time we have a general election. So I completely agree with Nick that actually all bets are probably off at this stage.
Just before we go to the news, what do you think of these attack ads, Jeremy?
Oh, I think it's bad news all round. I think the idea that you say something unbelievably awful about an opponent as a kind of gesture towards them is not very good or very sensible. I do not believe in that sort of thing. I was invited many times as leader to agree and approve similar styles of things, and I just said, no, I'm not going down that road. I'm not going in that direction. I want us to put forward a positive message about the kind of society we want to create. I want people to support and give votes out of hope, not fear.
Do you think in retrospect, though, that was naive? Because, I mean, history shows in Australia and America, negative political advertising can work. Maybe this country is different, I don't know.
What do you end up with as a result of that, though? Other than a nasty, puerile politics, which is based on how nasty you can be about the other person. Yeah. You've been there as well. I was once in the US during part of a senatorial election. I think it was in Virginia, and I had nothing to do one evening, so I turned on the television and I watched almost an hour of political advertising. It was the most unbelievable stuff being thrown by candidate A at candidate B and candidate B. At the end of it, is this the best they can do?
I agree with Jeremy to a large extent.
Is this the best you can do?
The biggest issue with those ads is that they were just barefaced lies. There's nothing wrong with being honest and upfront about the truth or failure, but they were just false, and that's what made them even more cheap and vile and wrong.
Right. Well, that was a spirited discussion. We'll have another one in a minute on something completely different. It's 8:34 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
The wife of a British Russian opposition leader has described the government's response to his imprisonment as weak. Vladimir Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years in prison by a court in Moscow after being convicted of treason. A senior Tory MP installed panic alarms in every room in her constituency home after her children, aged 2 and 4, were subjected to death threats. Alicia Kearns is the MP for Rutland and Melton and told LBC that installing panic alarms is a symptom of a reality that faces many MPs. And a protester has thrown orange powder over a table at the World Snooker Championship in Sheffield. He was one of 2 members of Just Stop Oil who invaded the stage at the Crucible, forcing play to be suspended. LBC weather, most areas dry with some clear spells tonight and a low of 5 degrees.
LBC.
Question with Jeremy Corbyn, Nick Gibb, Sarah Olney and Samuel Kasumu. Let's go to our next question. It's from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Good evening, all. My question is, yesterday on LBC, Conservative Party chairman Greg Hands, by name and nature, said that public services were in, quote, great shape. My question is, are they really?
Well, Samuel Kasumu, as an aspirant mayoral candidate, let's stick with London public services for now. Everyone else can talk about it nationally. If you're going up to someone on a doorstep, can you really defend the state of public services in London?
It depends on what services you're talking about, and some, for example, your education will be run at a very local level. So I think it won't be a one-size-fits-all. Having said that, we know that these are very tough times for everybody, particularly economically. But this is still one of the greatest countries to live in the world. But this is still one of the greatest cities to live in the world. So,
what do you say to somebody who has to wait 2 weeks to see a GP? Because that was not the case before the Conservatives were in power. You can blame the pandemic however much you like, but in the end, if people can't get to see a GP and can't get the health advice that they need, you cannot say that public service is in great shape.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're clearly spending record sums of money on our National Health Service, but it's still a challenge for people to get GP appointments and for people to get operations, and have long waiting lists. So there are big challenges that certainly we are facing as a country. But I think it is also important to recognise that we are in a fantastic country. And I always tell people that there's a balance and some nuance. Even though we can do better, it doesn't mean that things are all doom and gloom.
Give me one public service that's in great shape.
I mean, I've travelled over the last 2 years, since I left my role as Special Advisor at Downing Street. I've travelled to a lot of countries across the world. And one of the things I would say is we've got a fantastic transport system, particularly in London. Yes, there's still room for improvement, but it is...
So you'd like to pay tribute to Sadiq Khan for that?
I'd like to pay tribute to central government for all the funding for things like the Elizabeth line, and not necessarily Sadiq Khan, who I think could be doing a lot better, of course.
Right, let's just recap the question. The Conservative Party chairman, Greg Hand, said on LBC yesterday that public services are in great shape. Are they really, Sarah Olney?
Well, it doesn't feel as if they are, to be honest. I would be really interested to hear what his evidence is for that. I mean, certainly in my constituency, we're seeing... we know that the teachers are going on strike next week. Parents across my constituency, myself included, having to take a day off to look after their children. We know the doctors are on strike, the nurses are on strike. Ambulance wait times, I think, are at the worst that they've been. We've got 7.1 million people on NHS waiting lists. You can't register with an NHS dentist anywhere in my constituency. It's really hard to get a GP appointment. I think under the surface, there's lots and lots of people working really, really hard, and I want to make sure that that's something that I want to pay tribute to all those people who are doing their very, very best to make it work. But there's no doubt that in all sorts of different areas, it really feels that things are creaking at the seams. There was a report yesterday about the wait for mental health services for young people, for example, and this is something I see almost as the most critical thing in my constituency, the very, very, very long waits that young people are experiencing for mental health services, and it's absolutely crushing. So I just don't know what Greg Hand is looking at when he says they're in great shape. And I think one of the biggest issues for every kind of public service is the workforce issue. And we've talked about this, I think, before, in relation to the NHS, but we're also seeing it in schools. We've just talked about maths teachers, for example. And I think that's the bit that we've really got to focus on. We need to make our public sector an attractive place to work. We need to encourage people to come and work in it. We need to address the issues that are causing people to leave. And that's something that we've really got to focus on.
Nick Gibb.
Well, look, standards are rising in our schools. Since 2010, we're rising in reading of 9-year-olds from joint 10th to joint 8th. In the Pearls International Survey, we're rising in terms of our maths ability, both in PISA, which is a 15-year-olds, and in TIMS, which is a grade year 5 and year 9. So we're doing well in terms of standards in our schools, and I would pay tribute to the 400,000 teachers in our schools who have made that happen. In terms of the health service, we're spending record amounts. As Samuel said, we're spending £152 billion a year
You
now
can say till you're blue in the face how much you're spending, but if people's own real-life experiences are not good, they're going to say, well, something's wrong. You're not spending it wisely.
Well, what's happening in the health service is we are recovering from the pandemic, which was the biggest crisis affecting this country for a century. And there is a backlog in elective surgery and treatments because of that crisis, and we are recovering from that, and that's why the health service is in such pressure. And even as we emerged from COVID, we had a resurgence of COVID and flu and childhood illnesses like scarlet fever as well. All those issues have to be handled by the National Health Service, and that's why we're in this crisis. But in terms of the doctors, there are 37,000 more doctors today than there were in 2010, 52,000.
2,000 fewer GPs.
And in terms of GP appointments, we know that there are almost 2 million more GP appointments this year compared to this time last year. So, of course, there are challenges and struggles, as I said, as we emerge from COVID. But, we are a government that's determined to tackle them, and we are putting in the money. 152 billion compared to 123 billion in just 2019-20. And, these are sizable sums of money that we are putting into our public services. And it will take time for them to be reformed.
Just on schools, why is it proving so difficult to come to an agreement with the unions? Because it wouldn't one way forward, and I put this to one of the panels last week on the health service, why don't you sort of say to the unions, well, look, we acknowledge that you have fallen behind in pay since 2010. We will commit to restore that over X number of years. Do you not just think that would be the right thing to do? Because obviously you're not going to be able to do a massive increase in year one. I think most people would understand that. But to actually commit to recognising that they have a case that they have lost out over that period, that would go some way to at least coming to an agreement in the end, surely.
Well, that's what we've been trying to do. Last year's pay rise was 5.5%, 4% on average. This year we were proposing 4.5%. We're also adding £1,000 to last year's pay rise, taking that 5.4 up to about 7.8% in percentage terms. So we are trying to do that within the parameters of making sure that we are doing so in an affordable way and that doesn't generate pressures on inflation, which would be the worst thing. So I'm disappointed by the decision of the four unions to reject the pay
But
offer.
do you recognise that they have lost out since 2010?
Yes, no, we do. And a lot of public sector workers have, indeed in the private sector too. As we went through all those years recovering from the banking crisis, and then we had COVID, and now we have the Ukraine and the surge in energy prices. So there are real issues that have hit the British economy. But I think this government has handled all those crises extremely well.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, it's a good question from Robbie. And if you think through public services, nearly all of them rely heavily on the moral exploitation of public sector workers to work beyond their hours, to work at nights, work at weekends, just to keep them going. Look, in every single service. I was talking to a group of doctors last week who were, albeit on strike outside the hospital, they were just telling me the pressures and strains they're under just to keep the hospital going. And they are paid £14 an hour for that. They could earn more money
Junior
doing
doctors,
almost well, junior doctors. These are people in their 30s who've spent 9 years training to get £14 an hour. It's not fair, not right. Look at care service. It is a complete nightmare. If your elderly relative, father, mother, grandfather, whatever, needs social care, very limited, very hard to get, and you would end up with one of your family members probably giving up work in order to care for them. We don't have an effective care service. No, the services are not working because we're not investing enough in them. And in the case of the NHS and the care sector, we're allowing the private sector to take too much out of them through privatisation within the NHS and the privatisation of care services. We need investment in public services that are publicly run.
Can I just say the challenges with that existing public services, and they're not perfect. I do push back on people that say that they're absolutely not working, but the challenges are not always economic, by the way. And I think it's very important to recognise that sometimes it's about the need for reform, sometimes it's about the need to find better ways at doing things. And I always get very nervous when somebody says, well, the solution must be more money. Firstly. Secondly, when there is an economic imperative or a fiscal need for
about money taken out of the services.
When there's a need for further investment, we always have to recognise that money must come from somewhere, right? And so it's either people get taxed more, or we borrow more, or we find efficiencies in other places. So there are always trade-offs in public services, and I often feel like the political class needs to be a bit more honest about what the art of the possible is when you're trying to make decisions.
But Samuel,
about
you've
services.
got private sector organisations in care and the NHS and in local government sucking resources out of our public service. £35 billion on track and trace. Where did it all go?
I don't know.
We'll leave that question. No, because we're running very, very late. I just want to say, Nicola, who's listening in Italy, says, I live in Italy and we had the COVID epidemic as well, but I can see my GP the same day or the day after. 8:48.
LBC
9 on LBC. Steve is in Beckenham and wants to ask our panel a question. If you've just tuned in, we're with Jeremy Corbyn, Nick Gibb, Sarah Olney and Samuel Kasumu. Steve, what would you like to ask?
Hello, Iain, my favourite Tory, essentially, first one. But the question I'd like to ask is having seen sort of Joe Biden's adventures in Ireland and enjoying it very much. I was in a pub and I heard lots of adverse comments about his age. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, why are they saying that? But are we an ageist society? And if so, what can politicians do to alleviate that?
Are we an ageist society? I'm going to prove what an ageist radio presenter I am and ask Jeremy Corbyn first.
So you've worked out the oldest one here, have you?
Just.
No way.
Just.
Yes, we are to some extent an ageist.
Did you feel that when you were leader of the Labour Party, though, that there was a bit of ageism there?
To me personally, no, I didn't. I did the job. People said, you're going to find all that very physically stressful. And I said, no, not the slightest. I mean, personally, I'm very lucky. I've got good health. I keep fit, eat well, and all that. But yes, we are an ageist society, and I don't think we should have compulsory retirement. And I think people should work if they want to, not be forced to by poverty or something else, but also recognise that older people can bring something to the table in terms of knowledge, institutional value and so on. Yeah. And the civil service spent so many years hollowing out older civil servants. They then found that all the institutional knowledge is gone. They then bring in incredibly expensive consultants who know sod all anyway. And we have a weaker civil service and public service as a result of it. And I think the comments made about older people are often horrible. You know, the descriptions often said, well, that would be a little old lady, wouldn't it? You know, it's awful. Talk about somebody and treat them with respect,
what about
irrespective of their age.
What about Joe Biden, though? Because there have been, shall we say, some moments that he's experienced in public which people do attribute to his age. Do you think that's unfair?
I do. I think they should just treat Joe Biden with respect as the President of the United States. Listen to what he has to say, agree with it, disagree with it. I disagree with some of it and so on and so on. You probably do as well. Treat him with respect and don't go on and on about the age. After all, Trump wasn't that much different anyway. I'll tell you what, when Gordon Brown was 70, he and I had a chat on the phone that day and I said, happy birthday. He said, Jeremy, our age has just begun.
You see, I dread. I mean, I've just turned 60 last year.
Is that all?
Thank you. But I dread 70. I absolutely dread it. 50 meant nothing to me. 60 did, but 70, well,
I mean, you're a bit younger than me, okay, but I just remember as a all right, 13 years, okay, let's get it out there. I just remember as a kid sort of thinking, wow, my granddad's 70.
Yeah.
And that was obviously a long time ago. I don't feel any of that. I get up in the morning and I go out doing stuff. And I'm kind of, maybe I'm a bit hyperactive.
See, that's what riding a bike does for you, I think.
I ride a bike, I run, I walk, I think.
Nick?
I don't think we respect elderly people in the way that some societies do, and I think that's a great pity. They bring experience, wisdom from all those years of living, and I think it's a pity. And I think we should. I think in terms of the economy, I think now we need people in the economy, whatever their age. We did remove the compulsory retirement age from the law, so people can continue to work beyond the retirement age. And I think now industry has got to do more to attract older people back into the workplace and make it easier for older people to remain in the workplace.
I agree.
Samuel?
Yeah, I think I'm a local councillor, a cabinet member, and what I see is there is so much benefit you can get from elderly people or older people, but being given an opportunity to... Sorry for looking at you.
It's all right.
being given the opportunity to... I'm just preparing for battle lines when we go head to head for the mayoralty. But being given the opportunity...
Well, you're going to call me old man?
No. There will be a poster, Jeremy.
Oh, so did you notice something? He said, "Are you going to call me?" Now, that was a hint there, Jeremy. That was a hint.
Well, there you go.
I didn't say what context you called me that.
But seriously, there's so much value to add. I'm really passionate about tackling digital exclusion, and it's not just about somebody who's older not being able to use a computer. Sometimes they might have arthritis or many other reasons. And so I totally agree with the notion that you need to respect the value that older people can bring, and more needs to be done to get them more economically inactive. We need more teachers. Why not re-engage retired folks who were maybe accountants who could easily add value in that respect?
Sarah.
Well, exactly that. I mean, there is we've talked a lot about the workforce issues we're currently experiencing, and there's no doubt that ageism is keeping some people out of the workforce, and that's something that we need to tackle. I think what's really important is that we try and implement as much lifelong learning as we can. And, even if you're over 60, if you've still got more to give, but you're feeling a little bit, as if your skills and experience are still valid, but you're finding it hard to apply them in a workforce which might be, in a workplace which might be thinking about adopting, AI, for example. I mean, that might feel like something you can't really access, but why not? Why shouldn't you be able to? But we've really got to be serious about making training and education available to people at every age so that we can do, make the most of people's skills and abilities, whatever they have to offer.
You should be a radio presenter because you've just given us a link into the next question by mentioning AI.
Oh.
Here's our fun question for the end, which everybody loves. Cara in Hackney says, a song created entirely by artificial intelligence which cloned the voices of rappers Drake and The Weeknd, heard of neither of them, to make them appear on... Are they a popular music beat combo, Samuel?
I know Drake. I'm a strange kind of younger person. Very cool.
Okay. All right. To make them appear on a track that neither of them had any part in making, and it's gone viral. If you could combine two legendary musical artists, dead or alive, through AI to make them perform together, who would it be?
Ooh.
Well, let me start you off by saying ABBA and Meatloaf. I think that would be a terrific
How about
combination.
Elton John and Cliff Richard?
I think they have actually sung together.
Oh, maybe. Oh,
Yeah.
so that's not very AI,
I
is
think
it?
they have. No, but you're right. I mean, given that ABBA have got these avatars now, you could actually make this happen.
Why don't you just bring in two groups where there's lots of arguments about who was actually in the group when they recorded the songs? The Archies, who did Sugar Sugar, and the Eagles, who did Hotel California. Nobody knows who was actually recording in the studio on the one that was actually broadcast.
Is that right?
Yeah, they're still arguing about it. Legal cases in American law, litigation, they love it. They love all that stuff. So, that'd be fun.
It would probably be Elvis and Sam Cooke.
Who's Sam?
Sam Cooke.
Sam Cooke.
You must know who Sam
You
Cooke
don't know
is.
Sam Cooke? No. Oh gosh. Long story. He was around during the time of MLK and
one of the
Malcolm
leading
X.
black musicians in the USA that
Change
paved the
Gonna
way
Come.
for others. Fantastic.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Well, I think you need like a really great vocalist and then a band who really know how to, do a track. So I think someone like Nina Simone with Daft Punk or Chemical Brothers, or that is going to date me a bit, but that kind of combination could be really, really brilliant.
Daft Punk. Nope, me not. Thank you very much indeed to our panel, to Jeremy Corbyn, Samuel Kasumu, Sarah Olney and Nick Gibb. We'll have you all back very, very soon. And we're looking forward to the London mayoral hustings where Jeremy and Samuel can possibly...
May the best man win.
All right, coming up in the next hour, how many of you watched the Grand National over the weekend? I lasted two fences because I think it is a spectacle. I know it's a national institution, but how anyone can defend a race which regularly kills horses year on year, I do not know. And I accept that the race organisers have made changes to it to make it safer over the years. But when you look at what happened over the first two fences, when I think it was over a dozen horses went out of the race, and that